How's it going, everyone? BrainChild here, and today I'm going to give some updated early impressions of Pokémon Sword and Shield based on the trailer from the new pre-E3 Pokémon Direct. Now, some of you might be remembering me being a bit critical of the game's graphics in the last analysis, and while I still stand by those criticisms, there are some slight improvements in the new trailer that I think are worth covering, so let's dive in. Okay, so once again we're getting hit with that disclaimer that the footage isn't from the final build, which is a good thing because it means that things are subject to change and there's still room for improvement before release. Now, my biggest takeaway from just this first shot, and by the way, we're not going to cover each frame by frame here, we're just covering noteworthy observations. But what jumps out to me about this shot is the lack of anti-aliasing, as evidenced by these crispy, jagged edges here. Now at this point I don't have any clean shots to be able to do any kind of reliable pixel count of the game's resolution, but I wouldn't be surprised if the game wasn't running at native resolution, but I guess we'll get confirmation on that closer to release. The egregious bloom makes an infamous return. To be fair though, at least this bloom is coming from an actual light source, so I'm not going to complain too much about that. I do like the little detail of the steam coming out of the storm drain though. Some of you may not know this, but this is a pretty common occurrence in real life in urban places like New York City, where warm water rushes through the sewer system, and as it passes under a storm drain, some of that water evaporates and travels through the vents, which then leads to vapor condensing due to the cold air surrounding it. And steam is essentially condensed water vapor, so there you go. Nice little science factoid for you. So yeah, the steam rising from the storm drain is a pretty nice touch. Looks like they're using semi-transparent plane textures to mimic the look of volumetric light shafts. That's pretty cool. So here we can see the Gaussian blur is still being used to mimic a shallow depth of field effect. I don't really expect it to change, but for anyone hoping that the developers switch to something more advanced, I don't think that's very likely. This Fresnel along the outline of the character model, it might be a bit much. I understand the visual goal isn't photorealism, so it's not necessarily a technical flaw, but subjectively speaking, I'm not a huge fan of the aesthetic choice here. So let's take a moment to talk about the cell shading in this game. Without getting too technical about this, something I'm noticing with the shading of the characters and Pokemon is that they don't have any actual self-shadows. Now in the previous trailer I thought that might have been because some of the parts of the models that were occluded by other parts were shaded how I expected them to be. But now I realize that wasn't because a shadow was cast on those parts, but it was just because of how the cell shading was done. Typically, if a surface isn't directly illuminated by light and sits in between another surface and the path to direct light, that other surface will be in shadow too. When both surfaces are on the same object, this type of occlusion is known as self-shadowing. When we look at the models here, that phenomenon isn't happening at all. No matter what angle we trace the shaded boundary to the surface beneath it, there's no shading whatsoever. So what this tells me is that the lighting calculated along the surface normals is done irrespective of where one surface is located relative to another surface. Now, cell shading doesn't necessarily need to use self-shadowing on character models to look good, but when models and environments are casting directional shadows like we can see here, it does tend to make the lighting of the character models feel a bit incoherent. So personally, I would very much prefer if the artist went the Breath of the Wild route and gave the model some cell-shaded self-shadowing. And the game is still in development, so they may enable self-shadows in the final version of the game. It's possible that the developers aren't able to optimize the game to a degree where self-shadowing won't negatively impact the performance too much. Or maybe they just don't want to enable it because it could compromise the artistic intent. Who knows, but it's definitely something that stands out to me, even though I don't think it'll be an issue for most people. So this is new. If you remember from the previous trailer, I mentioned how the fence posts had shadows, but the ropes in between them did not, which was kind of weird, but I figured it was just because the game was still in the early stages. We can see here that the shadows for the ropes have been added. So it's nice to see that they're still tweaking things and may possibly make other changes in the future. So this nice atmospheric haze that you see here is actually just another one of the many uses of the bloom shader as a cheaper alternative to volumetric lighting and fog. I'd say it works pretty well here. Oh man, look at the difference in the geometry and texture quality in this stack of books right here and the ones on the shelves. Gotta cut some corners somehow. Overall though, I'd say the texture work for the interiors is pretty serviceable. Some of the ground textures do appear to be a little bit more detailed than what we saw in the previous trailer, so that's good to see. Crop field still got that bloom, unfortunately, though not as blinding as it was in the previous trailer, but still. So I'm definitely seeing a boost in texture detail in this scene compared to the same scene in the earlier build. It's very slight, but it's still noticeable enough, even without a direct comparison. So that's pretty nice. The normal map detail in this shot looks pretty great. I see cube maps are still restricted to the distant environment, so no reflection of nearby objects, but they still look pretty good. Okay, now this is what I'm talking about. The scale on display here really puts things into perspective in terms of the graphical fidelity that we're seeing for this game. While it's technically not on the same level of complexity as something like Breath of the Wild, I'd imagine the developers have their hands pretty full needing to optimize for lots of different dynamic elements like roaming Pokemon, NPCs, weather changes, etc. So the game looks pretty good when you consider everything that's happening under the hood. I'm also noticing that their level of detail management appears to have improved as well with respect to both the close-up detail and distant detail. Wow, I've never been very eager to play a Pokemon game, but this one is kind of calling my name right now. See, this is one of those examples with cube map reflections where you can clearly see that the water is not reflecting anything in its immediate surroundings. When you're far away, it isn't so bad, but close up, it's yeesh. Is anybody else getting some Xenoblade vibes up in here? This is definitely relevant to my interests. Looks like they're using scale and transform functions to supersize the Pokemon. There doesn't appear to be any additional geometric detail in the giant versions of these models, so they don't quite hold up as well as the normal size versions. And just like the last trailer, the particle effects are the most visually striking component of this game's graphics. They look absolutely fantastic. I could watch these all day. The ground models look pretty great in the close-up scenes, I have to say. And as expected, they get reduced to practically cardboard cutouts when the game has to render more than a handful of them. Okay, the chromatic aberration here looks pretty sweet. I'm not usually a fan of the distortion effect when it's used liberally, but it has its place when used sparingly. So this looks like a good place to wrap things up. Overall, I'd say that my impression of the game's visuals is a bit more favorable this time. The game's presentation certainly isn't winning any awards, but considering the scale and scope of the game, I'm fairly content with how it looks, largely due to the game's distinct art style. I'm also pleased to see some modest improvements to the quality of the game's assets and lot management, and considering the disclaimer at the beginning of the trailer, I think it's fair to say that we can expect to see even more improvements upon release. Now, what those improvements entail is anyone's guess, but personally, I have a few things in mind that I hope will be addressed at some point. For one, it would be really awesome if the developers could implement some anisotropic filtering, but failing that, I hope we can at least get some trilinear filtering. The textures in the game would look so much better if they could be properly filtered at oblique angles. If you can't present textures somewhat remotely closely to their original detail, there's no reason to make them detailed in the first place. It's a waste of time and talent. Other than that, I really hope the character models and Pokemon models get updated with self-shadowing a la Breath of the Wild, because I feel that it would really help the models to blend more naturally into their environments. It would also be nice if we could get a minimal level of anti-aliasing. While a jaggy here or there might not be that bad, the image quality really takes a plummet when you have a lot of assets full of jagged edges cluttering the scene. To be clear, I'm not saying that any of the potential changes that I just mentioned are definitely going to happen, but I don't think they're all that unreasonable. Seeing as how the build shown off in the latest trailer has already improved since the last build shown a few months ago, I can't help but think that another 5 months could be just enough time to polish up the game's visuals that much more. So that's all for this tech analysis of Pokémon Sword and Shield. If you've enjoyed this video, feel free to give it a like and share your thoughts with us in the comments below. Be sure to stay tuned to GameXplain for more coverage on all things gaming. Cheers!